People often think that fearful avoidants leave because they finally just stop caring. But they often leave because caring actually feels too terrifying for them when abandonment starts to feel possible. So, in today's video, I'm going to help you break down and understand the exact reasons. There's three major reasons fearful avoidants tend to leave a relationship, other than just things being incompatible and them no longer being interested, so that you can start to either better understand yourself as a fearful avoidant or understand, if you're on the receiving end, why fearful avoidants often pull away when things start to actually matter, and why their nervous system often mistakes connection for danger when love starts to feel real. Here's the first thing. A fearful avoidant often leaves the moment that they start to feel deeply attached. Fearful avoidants, and I talk about this a lot on this channel, they grow up in an environment where love both feels like a good thing and a threatening thing. In other words, if you grew up in an environment where sometimes being around family and loved ones was nice, and there were some really good experiences, but other times it was terrifying or confusing and hurtful, then you actually get these competing messages wired into your conditioning about what love is and how it looks. For example, if somebody grew up with a parent who was an alcoholic, maybe one day that parent comes home and they've had a few drinks and they're in a good mood and they're loving and they're kind. But another day, that same parent comes home and they've had many drinks and now they're angry drunk and they're cruel and they're mean. And so what ends up happening is fearful avoidants show up very well in the early stage of relationships. They show up very well when dating, and they can be very present and open and genuinely interested, and they're good at getting people to feel comfortable and vulnerable. But then the moment they start feeling vulnerable themselves, they move out of this side of them that feels like I love connection and I'm interested in people and I want to get close, into a space of like, wow, you're actually making me feel threatened because of how much I care. And when I cared a lot as a kid, I often got really hurt. And so oftentimes it can feel like the switch sort of flips for them because they start to feel this deep fear of that vulnerability causing pain, causing suffering. In fact, a lot of times there's very specific associations. They're afraid that when I'm too vulnerable, I will be rejected, or I will be abandoned in a situation, or betrayed, or I'll be made to feel unworthy. These are a lot of their big core wounds from an integrated attachment theory standpoint that cause them to often tailspin. And if they don't know how to heal this, then those core wounds show up the moment they start to feel actual attachment, the moment they start to feel real vulnerability. And now they need to sabotage the relationship and push somebody away to push that fear of that pain and suffering away that they are associating with the level of care that they feel for the relationship. And it's a very confusing thing to be on the receiving end of course, because you end up sitting there going, what happened? I thought that everything was going so well. But it's also a really hard thing to go through if you are the fearful avoidant, because they want love and yet they're scared of it. And in fact, still on point number one, before I get to these other 2 points, I want you to also understand that fearful avoidance, if you are one, oftentimes you'll store specific traits about people. So for example, if the caregiver or parent that you had who made you feel really unsafe, or if it was both of them in a situation where they were always fighting and at each other, the things that you associate as making the parents do those things. So let's just say, for example, your parents fought all the time and it was chaos and you felt like you were always caught in the middle and walking on eggshells. You may, as an adult, see people who have similar characteristics to your parents when they were fighting, maybe getting loud, or maybe being really harsh and shut down, or critical or cruel. You may see some of these things, and they can trigger such an intense nervous system response for you that you feel the need to run immediately, sometimes without much explanation to the other person. And even if you saw things, I was speaking to somebody the other day, and she said she had a parent who was really unhealthy in her childhood growing up. And that parent also happened to be very intense, very like larger than life, but kind of obnoxious, like always wanted to be the center of attention. And she said that the moment she sees people who have that trait, she literally shuts down so hard and closes off and wants nothing to do with people like that, because she associates that with a lot of pain that she experienced growing up. So you can see that you may actually meet people and feel threatened before deeply connecting if they tend to express certain traits that you once felt or associated with really painful outcomes in your own childhood. And if you want to do an exercise here before I move on to the other 2 points, you can actually look at, in your childhood experience, what were the things that caused you so much suffering or so much pain, and what traits in a person did you associate that with, or even what behaviors. I saw somebody else once say that they had a parent who drank frequently, And so the moment that they saw people had a little bit of wanting to drink too much within them, they had no room for that in a relationship. And listen, that could be a really healthy thing because obviously there's not a lot of upsides to drinking too much. But it was interesting because her standard of what was too much was that somebody expressed like a little bit of intoxication. It wasn't that the person was being belligerent. And so you could see that there was part of it was wanting somebody who didn't drink alcohol. And that's absolutely a totally acceptable need or standard to have in a relationship, but she had one that was also getting super dysregulated by her triggers. She also had this fear of like, oh my goodness, if somebody drinks and becomes a little bit intoxicated, what if they're like what I experienced growing up, and cause her to really shut down. So you can see lots of different sort of variations of this, but it'd be useful to take a look at yours and just be aware of them. Okay. It doesn't mean that you have to suddenly accept these things in other people. You're totally allowed to have boundaries and standards, but I want you to investigate, like, is there something, there's a trigger in there that I want to heal while maybe still honoring that boundary or standard that I set for myself in terms of what I'm looking for. Now, here's the second point. Leaving can feel a lot safer when somebody is feeling rejected. So when a fearful avoidant has a deep wound around rejection, helplessness, or this fear of being blindsided emotionally, if they see any kind of incongruency in a relationship, so for example, somebody says one thing and does something else, or somebody tells a story and that story changes ever so slightly over time, those types of situations are often so triggering for fearful avoidants because they relate incongruency to being a lot of uncertainty, which could cause a lot of problems. If they had a lot of problems growing up and saw really intense things, they're like, wait, why did the story change? How can I trust you at all? Am I going to trust you and then be left to feel helpless? Or am I going to trust you and then you're going to reject me? And oftentimes they will literally reject somebody. And again, sometimes seemingly out of the blue, because they are trying to protect themselves from, again, repeating these painful cycles that they're so afraid could happen in their own childhood. And it's really this protective strategy to avoid old pain. But a lot of times this pattern creates a very loss that they were trying to avoid and keeps repeating it until they see what's driving it. In other words, a lot of times you may reject somebody and run because it's something that you feel like, okay, this keeps me safe. But fearful avoidants really need to instead learn to communicate their needs in a relationship. That's the entire point of this, is to learn to communicate what your needs are so that you can say, hey, I didn't like this situation, or hey, I need some clarity or understanding here, some context around why the story changed. And a lot of times what you'll see in your journey to healing your fearful avoidant attachment style is that when you begin to communicate your needs or ask for clarity or transparency, a lot of things that you may have felt like you were overreacting to from a subconscious mind perspective that then in turn triggered your nervous system to react from this flighty kind of manner, a lot of times you'll actually find that those are quite solvable problems. In fact, a lot of times you'll actually see that the things that you were so concerned about are actually things where when you learn to just talk things out or hash out a conflict, you see that there's really good explanations for people's behavior. So for example, maybe they are, sort of clammed up and not talking very much. And then you ask them about it and you learn that actually they were holding something that they wanted to talk to you about and weren't sure how to approach it, or that they had a really hard day at work and they were feeling sad. And instead of you jumping to the conclusion, like, why are they clammed up? Are they pushing me away? Do they not like me? Are they about to reject me? Should I reject them first? Instead of going through that whole dynamic, instead you may see that, wait, there's actually more to a lot of these stories than sometimes the conclusions that I jump to. This brings me to point number 3. And before I get to point number 3, which is one of the most important things, I will just say, if you want to go deeper into healing your fearful avoidant attachment style, you can check out our Fearful Avoidant to Securely Attached program. It is designed to specifically help you in a really deep way leverage neuroscience and neuroplasticity to become securely attached in the shortest period of time possible. And I'll put that down below. You can check it out fully for free for a limited time. And with that, you actually get to keep free for life our Healing Codependency course, which will also help you understand any proclivity you have towards codependency, doing too much, not saying no, taking too much on, and how that can burn you into the ground and how to heal that as well. So that's literally a free gift that comes with your trial to the Fearful Avoidant Healing Program. Now, here's the third major thing, and this is one of the biggest things fearful avoidants do. They go into relationships and they overgive and underreceive. So they go into relationships and they do everything to get to know somebody very deeply and to get to know all of their needs and to show up for them. And they expect, just naturally, because that's the standard they hold themselves to, is an extremely high standard of how they show up in relationships. In fact, fearful avoidants tend to put this almost sacred pressure on themselves, where they feel like relationships are so sacred. There's all this pressure to not hurt somebody and to do everything properly and to pour into somebody with your whole heart, because they're very all or nothing. But then what ends up happening is most people are not holding themselves to that same standard. And most people have some degree of boundaries a lot of the time. And so what ends up happening is fearful avoidants overgive, then they under receive, then they end up feeling a little bit frustrated and taken advantage of. And they're going like, I'm trying so hard. Why isn't this person pouring back into me in the same way? But the reality also, and what you have to note, is that a lot of times fearful avoidants are not actually speaking their needs and telling somebody in a relationship what they do need. They often expect people to mind read in relationships. And that's something that is tricky because fearful avoidants themselves are so good at quote unquote mind reading. They're so good at reading between the lines, but not everybody else is built that way. That's the fearful avoidant attachment strategy. They learn to read between the lines. That was literally how they learned to attach in a chaotic environment. But nobody's ever going to mind read your needs completely, even if they're good at that. And most other attachment styles did not have that same degree of quote unquote training in being hypervigilant. And so what ends up happening is fearful avoidants are like, why isn't this person figuring out my needs and pouring in back as much as I am to them? And then they feel taken advantage of and hurt. And then through that hurt, they often feel rejected and they start to close down, and eventually cut somebody off and literally ice them out as a way to try to protect themselves and keep themselves safe. And that is often when, again, it feels like the rug is pulled out from the other person on the receiving end because they didn't see it coming. They thought everything was great. They usually had no idea that they weren't showing up in the way that you needed. And so it's super important for a fearful avoidant also to learn to communicate their needs, to speak up and to take up space. It's such an important part of healing and becoming secure, is learning to be vulnerable about what you need. And then you can vet to see how somebody shows up, but you are going to be shocked because people are going to show up so much better than you ever expected. If you're a fearful avoidant, leaving first may feel like self-protection, but it doesn't have to stay your pattern forever. In fact, a lot of times what you think is self-protection, when you really look, is actually hurtful and painful and seems to reinforce all of these fears that you had, that look, nobody's going to show up for me the way I show up for them. But when you heal these wounds beneath that impulse to run, and when you regulate your nervous system so that you don't go into such a flight response, intimacy stops feeling like a threat and starts to feel like something you can actually stay for. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I put daily videos out here to support you in your healing journey, especially around your subconscious patterns from childhood, your attachment style, your relationship challenges that you may be facing. And I hope you become a part of our community. Thanks for watching.